Good evening, everyone. I am so delighted that all of you are joining us tonight for our webinar on preaching and rape culture. It's going to be presented tonight by Reverend Dr. Neichelle Guidry, who is the Dean of Sisters Chapel at Spelman College and the Director of the Wisdom Center there. And so we're so excited to have her with us tonight. My name is Kentina Washington Leaphart, and I am the Director of Programs for Reproductive Justice and Sexuality Education here at the Religious Institute. And we know we have quite a few registrants tonight who are participating with us that may not be familiar with our organization. So just to give you a little bit of information about us, we are a multi-faith organization dedicated to advocating for sexual, gender, and reproductive health, education, and justice in faith communities and in society. And we do that in a lot of different ways. We do lots of education in congregations. We do work with seminarians, folks who are preparing for full-time ministry. We have online courses. We do preaching and workshops. We are involved with advocacy. So you may see us or have seen us potentially participating in the amicus brief this year earlier for the Masterpiece Cake case that went to the Supreme Court. We're organizing clergy around issues of faith. Also Planned Parenthood. We've done a lot of work related to access to full spectrum reproductive health care for folks. And so we've been very busy, in particular during this season of this new, not so new anyway, administration and all of the ways that they're looking to attack the very basic rights that we feel like all people should have access to. And so that keeps us engaged. And as I mentioned, we do much work with clergy as well as those who are preparing for full-time ministry. And that is what brings us to our conversation tonight with Neichelle. Neichelle and I met, I think I was going into my last year of seminary at Garrett, and you were coming in as a first-year PhD student and starting your ministry tenure at Trinity UCC in Chicago. And so we met and got to know each other a little bit during that time, her time there, and just became great colleagues and sisters in this work. And I have participated over the years in Neichelle's She Preaches programming, and she'll talk a little bit more about that as she gets into her work tonight with all of you. And so I'm just so delighted that she's going to share with us on the topic of preaching and rape culture, particularly as students are heading back to school this fall. Seminarians maybe initially starting their first year or matriculating through. Clergy are gearing up for the fall, and there's lots going on in the world around us right now that make this a topic that has always been relevant, but that is particularly relevant as we think about Me Too and how we can translate what's happening in the outer world and look at the ways that it's actually happening in the church, in our religious spaces as well. So I'm going to turn this over to Neichelle, but a couple of housekeeping items prior to us getting started. One is Neichelle is going to present her material for about the first 30 minutes or so of the webinar tonight. During that time, all of you who are participating have access to a chat box at the bottom of your screen. If you have questions, we are going to engage in dialogue with your questions after Neichelle does her presentation. So just put your questions in the chat box and I will be looking through those, and we'll try to get through as many as possible at the end of the presentation. I know there's lots of folks on, and so we'll try to get through as many as we can in the time we have tonight. Also, if you have any technical issues, we can try to help you with those as well. Our Director of Communications is behind the scenes, and he's working to help folks with technical issues. So if you do have any of those, please also send us a message in the chat box and we'll do our best to help you out there. And finally, we know that many of you are active Twitter users, as you have been retweeting Neichelle's tweets this week as she's been gearing up to be with us tonight. And so if you'd like to tweet tonight any of the material and your questions or what's coming up for you as you're listening to her presentation and engaging with her, we invite you to use the hashtag preaching and RC. So preaching, the word and, A-N-D, and RC, which stands for rape culture. So that'll be the official hashtag that we use tonight for our time together. So without further ado, I wanted to present to you the Reverend Dr. Neichelle Guidry, who is going to share with us tonight on the topic of preaching and rape culture. We hope that many of you got a chance to look at the links that we shared of the sermons and the discussions, because those will come up tonight, and they were just so rich and so fruitful as I was preparing to be on tonight. So I will turn it over to Neichelle.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Kentina, for the awesome introduction and words. I'm super thankful for the opportunity to share this space with all of you tonight. So special thanks to the Religious Institute for making the space for this conversation. As many of us know, we are living through and bearing witness to what I believe is an historic moment of reckoning that's happening from field to field, industry to industry, country to country, where, you know, women are breaking silence and systems are having to, you know, come to account for the ways that women have suffered, women and children have suffered. And, you know, it's been amazing to see that the church has not been exempt from the reckoning. And so I just want to share just a little bit about how I came into this work. But before that, again, I just want to make it very clear that I understand that this is not the easiest topic. And so anyone who's given even an hour of your time to have this conversation, to learn more, to gain your own insight and expertise into the craft of preaching and into the state of the church, thank you. Thank you. It's my prayer and my hope that the church will be better for this time, and that we will all be better stewards of the calls that are on our lives to be prophets in these last and evil days. So thank you for making the time to be here. Again, I also just want to share my handle on Twitter and Instagram is Neichelle G, and I'm really happy to continue the conversation once this is over in the Twitter sphere and the social media world, I guess. So how I got into this work, this is my dissertation. My dissertation is entitled Towards a Womanist Homiletical Theology for Subverting Rape Culture. And it was all about preaching, how preaching and preachers have been complicit in the complex web of the normalization of violence against women, also known as rape culture. I came into this kind of through my own painful and somewhat traumatic experiences of experiencing that kind of hypocrisy of the church, right? To be that safe space, that sanctuary, if you will, for God's people. And even those of us for when we weren't God's people, when we were pilgrims, it should have been a safe space. And it wasn't. And so not only did this come out of my own experiences, but it came out of my experiences as a pastor, having heard many narratives, having, you know, seen things that I wish I hadn't seen, you know, in a lot of different places, and just wanting to understand more about, you know, how do these things happen, you know, to the detriment of so many women, not only physically, but also spiritually, in such a way that it goes unchecked. You know, there's got to be something really insidious and systemic about this for it to be this deeply ingrained, inscribed into the fabric of the church. And that's what led me down the path of rape culture in the church. So that being said, I want to go ahead and jump into the conversation. I'm going to hit this. Hopefully I do this right. Sharing my screen. There's this PowerPoint here. Hopefully you all can see my slides. But again, all of the information there, all my handles, my blog, I'm again really happy to stay connected with anyone that's on right now. So just to provide a little bit of a roadmap here for what we're going to do tonight. First, we're going to start with defining rape culture. And I want to be really clear that in all of my definitions of all of my language here, I have tried really hard to keep it from being too jargony. I know that many of us are either in seminary or maybe just have an interest. So I want to be sure that I made this information as accessible as possible. So if there are any points of clarity at any point, be sure to take some notes, and I'm happy to answer those questions. Moving on from there, we'll talk about rape culture outside of the church. We'll talk about rape culture inside of the church. And then we'll get into the nuts and bolts of preaching. How does preaching perpetuate this culture? How can preaching disrupt this culture? And then we'll move into the question and answer. So again, I really want to encourage you all to be taking down your notes and utilizing the chat modality here so that we can make sure that everyone has as much clarity as possible. All right, so we're going to jump on into defining rape culture. Rape culture is a context in which dominant and normative attitudes, myths, and behaviors normalize or sanction any form of violence against women and children. And when I say violence, I want to be really clear that this includes various forms of violence. Ideological violence are schools of thought that support or promote the idea that women are weaker, are less able to lead, are more emotional, any idea that supports some kind of subordination on the basis of gender. Discursive violence is how we speak about women, how we speak to women, the kinds of the words, the language, and even the tone of our voices when we begin to talk about women. We'll talk about discursive violence a little bit more as it is of utter importance as we're talking about preaching. Of course, physical violence, legislative violence, when there are actual laws, systems, and policies that promote sexism, that promote misogyny, and write it into the law of the land, the law of our churches, the law of our denominations. This is legislative violence. So just a couple of things that I want to take some time to define, because in these conversations around rape culture, it's very common that we use words that have very similar meanings, but are nuanced and because of the nuances that they signify a different thing. So sexism is the systemic denial, exploitation, degradation, and oppression of women. Basically, this is an attitude, right? Women are less than, and on that basis, we will treat them differently. Patriarchy has everything to do with power. It is the systemic devaluation of women and the ascription of power to men, again, both on the basis of gender. Misogyny, the hatred, dislike, or prejudice against women. This is another attitude of disdain or mistrust of women on the basis of gender, but also on the basis of stereotypes about women's sexuality, women's emotional capacity, women's intellectual capacity, and the idea that, because women are less, whatever, fill in the blank than men, they are to be critiqued and hated on that basis. And finally, this is a word that's kind of a little bit newer to our lexicon, but of utter importance, and was used about 250 times in my dissertation. Misogynoir was coined by Moya Bailey, who was a scholar at Northwestern University in 2010. And this is a word that means the co-constitutive anti-Black and misogynistic racism directed at Black women. My work has specifically to do with anti-Blackness and racism and patriarchal structures in the Black church, as I am a daughter of the Black church and a member of Black churches, have been a member of Black churches. So I've been really concerned with that, and I've been really concerned about how in defining these words, right? Again, there is a lot of overlap, but in discussing attitudes, it's very different when we're discussing how such attitudes support actual systems and structures of oppression. And so I think it's really helpful to be able to define with clarity so that we can see that while these are not the same, they're operating in tandem. Okay? So now moving into where do we see rape culture? How do we know that we live inside of rape culture outside of the fact that rape happens and all different forms, all kinds of varying forms of sexualized violence and assault happen all the time? One of the things we have to really be clear about rape culture is that it is inclusive of actual forms of this physical sexual assault, but it is not. It's not reduced to that. Because before an act of physical violence ever takes place, there is a perfect storm, again, of attitudes, myths, and behaviors. And there's always usually 100,000 other little things that happen along the path to an actual occurrence of sexualized violence or rape. And this is what it means to live inside of a rape culture. I'd like to anchor some of my discussion on rape culture in the scholarship of Peggy Sanday, who wrote about rape-prone societies. I'm going to pull this research out here inside of an essay that she wrote called Sociocultural Context for Rape, a Cross-Cultural Study. Peggy Sanday in 1981 described what's called a rape-prone society. And she described it as such. In rape-prone societies, rape incidence is high. Rape is a ceremonial act, or rape is used to punish or threaten women. Rape-prone societies are identified by factors such as lower female power and authority, male expression of contempt for women as leaders and decision makers, high rates of interpersonal violence, and a high value of toughness and aggression as male characteristics. She contrasts this by writing about rape-free societies in which women were valued and respected. And one of her powerful conclusions was that men are not prone to rape on account of their biology, but are socialized for rape within a matrix of cultural forces or acceptable attitudes or behaviors. So what I really have appreciated not only about her scholarship here, and this is just such a brief snippet, I know I'm not even doing it justice, but she talks about the fact that no one is born, right, with this kind of innate drive to just go and rape, right? Or in terms of men, but they're taught that there's a certain use for that kind of force in reinforcing the power that men are to have within certain contexts and certain societies and cultures. So it really goes against this idea that has been used for a very long time to somewhat justify or explain our rape culture. It's just inside of men's nature to do that. No. There's a certain point in rape-prone societies where a man is taught that it's okay to do that, and that that he will suffer little to no consequence for doing that. And not only is it okay, but there's a certain usefulness, there's a certain utility for utilizing that kind of force. So reading that, I've been able to say, well, the United States is certainly a rape-prone society, you know, if it's just on the merit of these metrics, you know, we are certainly living. But how do we see this? What is rape culture? How does it materialize? Okay, we have some things here on the screen. We see it in the media. We see television, movies, music, literature, and it's not just in the sexualization of women's bodies, right? But it's in the ways that women are often positioned as prey, right? I as a Black woman, I always have my deep loves of hip hop and my memories of hip hop, but I will always also, and now more so than ever, be more critical because of the kinds of violence that's done to women ideologically, discursively. And I know that there were a few years ago, there was an uproar, rightfully so, about a lyric from, what was his name? Anyways, a rapper who talked about slipping Molly in her drink and basically having his way with this woman. And that was a pivotal moment in kind of the landscape of American popular culture, because that really kind of catapulted us into a conversation, not just about hip hop, but about how normal it is to hear these suggestive kind of tropes of violence and promoting violence against women. And I remember around that time that a woman by the name of Zerlina Maxwell kind of just emerged. And she was so fearless and so undaunted and unbothered in her public denunciation, not only of the lyric itself, but calling out rape culture. And, you know, even, you know, for me, having been trained as a rape advocate in high school and volunteered in various feminist settings throughout my life, I was a novice to hearing this language. And that happened as a result of the media, of music. So moving on, in the workplace, we know that women suffer from workplace harassment. Women are also subject to unequal pay. Women are also subject to having to do more work with less respect. In the home, we know that the majority of cases of sexualized violence happen not by strangers, but by partners, by family, by people that we know. And I wanted to say I'm not a numbers and figures person, and I've read statistics, but I don't memorize numbers. And so I can, there's lots of sites out there. I'd be happy to share sources on this, but I don't remember numbers, but I can say the majority of those cases are committed not by strangers, but by people that we know, often that are in close proximity. Schools, I mean, I love where I work. I love Spelman College, but, you know, Spelman College kind of stays in this national conversation with our, you know, sibling school right next door that kind of, you know, Title IX is a real thing, and Title IX is necessary because there's a certain sense in which you get young people in a space sometimes, and you know, anything can happen, and there has to be a presence on campus that says that some things are not okay. In our streets, I mean, I am one of millions of women who feels at night that it's not okay to walk around by myself, and the catcalling culture, and you know, Gwen Stefani came out with this song a couple years ago, I Ain't Your Holla Back Girl, you know, Queen Latifah and UNITY. I mean, we've all experienced the streets to be volatile spaces. In the criminal justice system, we can see that a lot of victims or alleged victims have to go through a lot of unnecessary scrutinization of their character and their sexual past and whatnot, to just have their cases heard whereas many perpetrators and alleged perpetrators don't undergo the kind of, we see low sentencing, we see no sentencing, we see no judgment, we see unequal convictions for Black women who come forth and break the silence about their assaults. So we see that this system is not only biased and along the racial line, which we know it is. Hello, New Jim Crow. Hello, Equal Justice Initiative. But we also see that it's pretty messed up along this line of gender as well. So what we're seeing is that there is none of these attitudes, myths, and behaviors, as suggested by the term culture, operates in isolation, but they lean upon each other. They're so interconnected that anywhere a woman goes, these things and these messages are reiterated. And I think that this is probably, in my opinion, one of the greatest evidences of a rape culture is that a woman, or perhaps someone who is not inside of the gender binary, children sometimes, but certainly speaking from my experience as a woman, this is one of the greatest evidences of a culture, is that you walk around with a sense that anything can happen to me. It's this abiding sense of not being safe, an abiding sense of having a body that is vulnerable to unwanted advances, and the nervousness that comes from that, and the fear that comes from that. I have an app on my phone that anytime I start to feel like I'm nervous in my surroundings, I can push a button, and if I'm holding down on it long enough, it calls 911 for me, and the GPS on my phone lets them know where I'm at. And this is the kind of stuff that women need, right, to give ourselves a sense of safety. Women are taught not to dress a certain way. You're taught not to provoke, right? You're taught if you put your drink down, don't pick your drink back up. You know, so outside of these kinds of these manifestations, these iterations that are on this screen, there is the socialization of women that by the time you hit a certain age just results in an abiding sense of vulnerability. And in that sense, can't nobody tell me that there's no such thing as a culture of sexualized violence against women. The last point that I want to make is that race complicates everything, right? I would love to be able to say that, you know, that there is such a thing as universal sisterhood. But I think that the racial dynamics in this country, at least, are such that Black women suffer more. They suffer more discursively. In every way, right? Black women are more so vulnerable, more so victimized. So let's keep that in mind. Okay, so nitty gritty, rape culture inside of the church. So in my work, what I have basically argued is that church, capital C, church, lowercase c, Black church, all of that, it arises out of context. Church is deeply contextual. At least it should be if it's going to be effective, right? Deeply, deeply contextual. And that's dating back to the genesis of the church, right? Even before it was institutionalized. The church picked up ideas of what it meant to be human, and ideas of structure, and ideas of ritual, and we became countercultural as a result of being immersed in a culture that Jesus himself said wasn't good enough, right? But we did arise out of it. And I think one of, to our detriment, the church, for lack of a better word, inherited this culture and has been so unashamed and somewhat proud of it that to call the church out now for being a patriarchal institution, for being an institution that is anti-Black, for being an institution that is anti-woman, is now as a prophetic thing. And so there is a rape culture inside of the church. And I want to preface this by saying that the church has utilized its theologies to sanction the culture. And so that being said, how do we know? So a couple of markers of RC in the church: the predominance of male leadership and unequal distribution of power. This legislative violence that is also ideological, that is just violent, period. That before it might not be an act of physical violence, but when you put people in different levels of hierarchies, where on the basis of gender, men are allowed to lord over, right? To be the head of this kind of language that promotes the preeminence of maleness and justifies, again, the unequal distribution of power. We are talking about an intrinsically patriarchal institution. Theological constructions of gendered hierarchies and permissible sexualities. We know that ideas of actually, let me keep going because I don't want to get ahead of myself. Theologies of atonement and forgiveness. Theology of atonement emphasizing violence and in its basic core, suggesting to us that God utilizes violence to achieve God's means. Specifically looking at the crucifixion of Jesus. But the ways that this atonement idea has promoted violence across the board has even, in my research, caused some women to think that because I have experienced violence, perhaps God loves me more. And that is absolutely destructive, right? Then you have this idea of forgiveness without accountability. Forgiveness without repentance. Forgiveness without justice. And again, these theologies, atonement and forgiveness, have been put to survivors of sexualized violence as means of absolving the guilty, but also as means of coping, right? To people who are Christian and who are people of faith. In some sense, the idea is soothing, more soothing than justice, right? Because justice, you got to be prepared to fight for that. But atonement and forgiveness, it puts survivors in a position of passiveness that, again, negates accountability, and kind of perpetuates violence. Okay, moving on. The sexual socialization of women. This idea that the purity of women is most valuable, right? Than a woman's own awareness of her sexuality and, God forbid, enactment of her sexuality. The True Love Waits movement. I will never forget the day when I was growing up and this woman at my church comes up to me and was like, I have a gift for you, and God told me to give it to you. And she opens up her hand, and it's a True Love Waits ring. And I'm like, I don't really know what to do with it. And so she explains what it means. And, I was like, I appreciate the sentiment, but that's not your decision to make for me, right? And I think there was this idea of, here's this like promising young woman, this, XYZ, and Wouldn't it be great if she saved herself for her husband? You know, deeply, deeply steeped in this heteronormativity, deeply, deeply steeped in this idea that anyone can make decisions about our bodies other than us, especially when you're young, you know. I used to always wonder to myself, well, not always, but when I got a little older, like, why were people talking about, you know, sex in such legalistic ways before you even have an idea in the youth group to formulate your own ideas and opinions? Again, how we're socialized. The Pinky Promise movement, I know that this woman, Heather Lindsay, has this huge following of disciples and has, you know, basically, you know, risen to prominence and popularity on this idea that if you do things God's way, you'll get God's blessings, you know, and it's like she's really clear about what that means, right? And it has everything to do with this tame, pure, acceptable sexuality, and that anything outside of that is deeply sinful. So we evoke the language of sin when we're talking about these things without even talking about how that language translates, without doing the work of translating that to the to the realities of violence that are done, as also being deeply problematic. Policing of women's bodies. I think this kind of feeds into things that I've already said. Clergy inaptitude to adequately address sexualized violence. And I think the Religious Institute put an article up today that was really, really amazing in response to what's happening in the Catholic Church. 10 myths or something about sexualized violence in the church. And I think that's an incredible example of our just clear inaptitude to adequately address sexualized violence. Some of it, I think, stems from the fact that we don't know how to talk about sexuality, period. And that in many churches and many ecclesial spaces, sexuality itself is still taboo. Sexuality itself is still demonized. And so if we can't even talk about that in its natural, innate, life-giving sense, how then are we going to do the work of talking about it in its most violent iterations? We just haven't gotten there. We can't deal with it. We see instances all the time of, I've heard many stories. My pastor told me to forgive my attacker, told me to go back into my domestic violence situation, told me God would be mad if I left him, told me God would be mad if I pressed charges, told me that it was my duty to suffer through it and that God was testing me. Inaptitude. And do you see how even that is a part of this complex? It's a part of the web that perpetuates the violence and keeps women vulnerable. Clergy sexual abuse and webs of complicity. Without doing too much damage, I know Church 2 has happened. And Church 2 has happened in similar ways to Me Too, as a result of women finally stepping forth. Like, my pastor did this, my youth pastor did this. We saw it at High Point Church. We saw it a couple years back at New Birth here in Atlanta with Bishop Eddie Long. We saw it. We see some really interesting unfoldings right now in Willow Creek and in Chicago, and we keep seeing stuff at the Catholic Church. So what we see here are not just the abuse that's being done by clergy, but we see that all around the perpetrators and the victims are people who know what's happening, who refuse to say anything, who refuse to do anything about it. These webs of complicity that enable the violence to continue to take place. All right. So I want to be mindful of my time. How do preachers perpetuate this through preaching? I want to hearken here to some of the videos that were sent to you. The first one being the "I Am Still the Man" sermon, which I think is case in point, right, of how preachers and how preaching is absolutely complicit in participating in this culture. So I'll make those connections as I go through these. So first things first, and as we're getting into the conversation on preaching proper, I want to lift up something that my pastor said in the last video that you got. Was my first pastor, my mother in ministry, Dr. Claudia Anderson Copeland. And if you haven't watched that, I highly recommend it. But one of the things she says about preaching is that it's inadequate to talk about the doing of preaching without talking about the being of the preacher. And I think this is a perfect example of how you can't talk about one without the other. And I'll also get into some spirituality stuff towards the end. So if the preacher is an avoider, that is an act of perpetuation. You just don't want to talk about it. Even though it's all over the news, or even though you know it's happening in your congregation, especially if you doing stuff you know you ain't supposed to be doing, you will be avoiding the issue. So avoidance, even in the face of a great need, is a huge perpetuation. Barring women from the pulpit and varying leadership roles when you maintain or when you sequester power to those who are men, that is a perpetuation of rape culture through preaching. And when you do not allow people to bear witness to women preaching, you do not allow people, women, young girls in particular, to imagine something different happening, to see themselves, which is a long-term perpetuation of these sexist structures. Underscoring patriarchal values, both in the text and in the present. So here is where I kind of want to draw on that, that sermon that was sent out, the "I'm Still the Man" sermon. We saw in that sermon how there was so much power playing. There was so much deployment of power, and so much avoidance of accountability in that, right? That sense of, I can do what I want. I can, I can commit the crimes that I want to commit. And guess what? I'm still the man. That is the heart of the message. I will still be the man. Underscoring patriarchal values with no consideration for justice, accountability, or any of it. Patriarchal hermeneutics, particularly in the interpretation of women's lives and stories in the Bible. And three ways that we see this happening is erasure of women from our pulpits, not bringing their stories, not bringing our voices, perspectives into our preaching, reifying stereotypes of women. So when you are bearing witness to a preaching moment and they want to talk about women and being emotional or stigmatizing women's bodies and our bodily functions, I hate when I see preachers start to do this kind of stuff when they're talking about Black women. I hate that. When you start to see the evocation of stereotypes of women that support the idea of women being weaker and less than, this is how, patriarchal hermeneutics or the modality for interpreting, and outside of context. So when I hear that sermon in particular, it's such a fascinating example of uncontextualized preaching, because what we know about the text that he preached on, the actual sermonic text was an indictment, right? It was the prophet Nathan, I believe, indicting David. You're the one that committed this crime. You're the one that's going to pay for it. But the preacher somehow used that idea of, you're the man, to finesse his power, and it was a complete disregard for the integrity of the message. And he jumps to the psalm to kind of soothe himself, right? But in nowhere did you hear about the actual crime that took place in the text of the rape of Bathsheba. You never heard about the fact that David actually did suffer the loss of the child that was created as a result of the rape. You never heard about, the multiple sins that were committed in the murder of her husband, the abuse of his power in calling for her. It was a bad sermon. And I want to talk more about it, but I'm looking at the clock. But that is case in point of what not to do. And I want to talk more about the context of that sermon itself, because that makes it even worse. But I don't want to be libelous. So there's that. More ways that we perpetuate this is androcentric liturgical language, when we're not inclusive in how we regard our congregations. When we talk about, hey guys, guess what guys, this morning there's this and that. When we're androcentric in our language with brothers and sisters, even that is not expressing the fullness of who might be in the room now. And certainly when we're talking about God, Father, He, King, His, it's an age-old conversation that by now I wish was more normative, but many of us, this is our default. We talk about it. We talk to a God whose face is male, whose body is male. And there's a lot of work that we have to do to undo that. But if we are not intentional in our proclamation about speaking of and to a God that is more reflective of the vastness in the room, we're doing damage. And it's so easy, right, to just say God, God's self, or to think creatively. This is a powerful opportunity for liturgical exploration and artisticness, right? To think expansively within the context of worship about how we talk to God. And we might not think about it, but when we speak to God simply with these androcentric terms, particularly when we're talking to God about God's power, we are then reifying the idea that power belongs to men, right? And that men are the ones who know what to do with that kind of power. We have to think more expansively, broadly about how we talk to God. And then there's a whole industry around preaching, right? Outside of Sunday morning, there's a whole industry of conferences and workshops and these kinds of things where and on my Facebook, I just love that I have Facebook friends. I have actual brothers and sisters who will post these flyers of these conferences and these, lineups that have nothing but men on them. And at this point, it's like another one bites the dust, because we see it all the time that, you might not have one woman on a flyer. You might not have one, as if one would be enough, right? Sequestration of women at non-gendered conferences. Women go in that room. Women get that hour. Women preach on that stage. And pay discrepancies, which I posted about on Black Women's Equal Pay Day. The church is not exempt from it. So turning the corner, how can we as preachers utilize our preaching to disrupt rape culture? First things first, again, that being part is self-criticism and reflection. Have I deconstructed my own internalized patriarchy? What kind of work have I done on myself to be a disruptor, right? Which I think is an ongoing process. Then Addressing topics of sexism, patriarchy, race, and sexualized violence head on. If these things are not friendly to us, why are we friendly to them? Why do we want to act like they're not happening? Why do we want to be careful? Why do we head on, right? And how can you do that? Narratives, right? Even if you don't personally know someone, which if the statistic of 9 out of 10 women have been raped is true, then you know more than one person. But say, for instance, one of those people has not wanted to speak out about it. You can go on the internet, you can pick up a book and enter into this kinds of work by lifting up the narrative of a survivor. Say her name, say her story. Then there are statistics. There you can go to RAINN.org, RAINN.org, and find up-to-date statistics of things that are happening. Biblical narratives. I mean, that's a novel thought, right? Because it's risky and it's hard to preach on the texts of terror, right? But the texts of terror are a preacher's entree, right? No one, right? I get it. It's hard to talk about Tamar, and it's hard to talk about Dina, and it's hard to, but the narratives are there not just for preachers to enter into it, but to talk about what it means. That's in the Bible too, right? If it's in the Bible, how is that text less sacred, less holy than the Psalm 23 that you done preached on 12 times already? It calls us to deal with the hard realities of our lives by dealing with the hard realities that are in the text. And I have, as a homiletician, said, if it's there in the story, in the book, if for whatever reason it got chosen and canonized, then that is God's invitation to speak a word on it. And what you're going to say, simple message. You don't have to be deep with it, but there is a disruptive power to this simple message. Mistreatment of women is wrong. Doesn't have to be any more sophisticated than that. It's wrong. Okay. Some of the kinds of hermeneutical kinds of guides that I use, right, that I want to share. Because one of the most amazing and easy ways to disrupt rape culture is to preach on the women of the Bible. I mean, how many times have you heard a sermon about David? How many times have you heard Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? How many times have you heard Jesus and Paul when Naomi is there and Orpah is there and Dina is there and how the list goes on. So here are some of my metrics that I'd like to share with you. When you choose a woman to preach on, say, for example, the woman with the issue of blood, some questions. Am I humanizing her? Am I telling the truth about her context? Have I done my research into her context? Have I read varying insights? And I know that some people don't like to read too much before they do their own exegesis, and I support that. But if you don't know, then it helps to read. Am I suspending my own judgment? Am I challenging my own stereotypes of women, of poor women, of women of color, of sick women, of women in that context? Am I suspending my judgment? Am I telling the fullest version of her story that I can? How might preaching her story impact the women in my congregation? How might it impact my congregation as a whole? How might her story impact my context where I'm at? And so I'll lift up one example. I serve on a board, 2 boards for Planned Parenthood. And I often evoke the woman with the issue of blood to talk about why I serve Planned Parenthood, because it's obviously a very polarizing organization in a lot of Christian circles. But I talk about how, contrary to what a lot of people think about or know about PP, pregnancy termination is not the only thing that PP does. In fact, that's 3% of the services that PP offers. The other 97% is healthcare, right? Reproductive healthcare, particularly for poor women. And as a recipient and a former patient when I was in college, I know for a fact that PP is saving lives. And I often evoke the woman with the issue of blood, because here's this woman in the story who says to Jesus, after she's touched him, she said, I went to all the doctors that I could, and they did not heal me. They did not even attempt to, but they took all my money. I came to you as a last resort. And it's a good thing that there's more healing in the hem of Jesus's garment, because the system put her in a position where she couldn't count on the healthcare system. It put her in a position where she couldn't count on the physicians. She was literally at her wit's end, poor, without resources, desperate for healing. And I often make that parallel between that hem of his clothing and how Planned Parenthood has functioned in a lot of poor Black and brown communities. Women, trans folks, even men and children who've been locked out of this capitalistic healthcare system often turn to PP as a last resort, and are there able to get some of the healthcare that they need to get. And so it's amazing when you really look through a lens, right? Your hermeneutics, how you interpret the text, it brings all different kinds of layers of meaning. And so to my women, to my sisters who are on, I encourage you to read through the lens of your experience. And I think this is why I practice womanism. This is why I'm a woman, because our womanist foremothers told us that your lived experience as a Black woman is your point of departure into doing theology, your point of departure into doing preaching. And as a praxis, that is very, very helpful to the brethren on the line. I think it's going to be really helpful in this case to read and to actually talk to the women in your lives and to actually engage on a human level their struggles, which is why I put that Pastor Claudette Copeland video out to y'all. That's just, if you're ever wondering what's happening on the inside and the soul of a woman, the interiority of a woman who preaches in particular, I don't know, that's just a powerful and amazing body of work right there. 3 metrics for a sermon that attempts to do the work of disrupting patriarchy, disrupting rape culture. 1, it is prophetic in its denunciation of violence against women. Prophetic being naming, prophetic being honest, prophetic being real about it, calling it out. It's disruptive in its inclusion of women's voices, stories, and perspectives. And why is it disruptive to include women's voices, stories, and perspectives? Because in this dominant rape culture, there are lengths gone to erase women's voices, stories, and perspectives. So I often think about, when I think about disrupting, I think about the woman who arrived at Simon the leper's table to wash Jesus's feet. She was not invited. In fact, they had a problem that she was there, but she was there anyway, disrupting. So anytime you include women, include our voices, our stories, and our perspectives, it is disruptive. Finally, it promotes healing for survivors and wholeness for entire communities. Because what we know about rape culture is that because it is exhaustive, survivors are not the only ones who are impacted. Although that is its own kind of violence, but even perpetrators need some rehabilitation and jail time, right? But we should also be concerned for the fabric of our communities as we are preaching as agents of good news and agents of grace to our broken communities. How do preachers utilize preaching? Again, here is where I want to turn to, as I've talked to you about some actual, meat and potatoes, some practical tools, I want to talk now about spirituality. What's the kind of spirituality that undergirds this kind of preaching? One is boldness, to challenge any form of gender discrimination in your church, your association, your synod, your denomination. And that takes boldness. To break silence quickly. And again, I think one of the things that we're seeing in some of these occurrences that are happening all over the country and world is that they were happening for years or took place years ago, right? And we know that over that kind of time of silence and complicity, wounds fester and systems are reified. And so as quickly as possible, we have to break silence. Utilize your seat at the table to speak up for women's dignity and safety. Especially if you're male-bodied, this is probably one of the easiest ways to be in solidarity. And not easy in terms of it's easy to do it, but it's a layup, right? To utilize your seat at the table to speak up for those who are not as powerful as you. Develop systems of accountability that involve justice. And by justice, what I mean is police reports and prosecution. That's what I mean. And finally, a spirituality of subversion. And where I hang my hat in my work is that for as much as I believe that two things, that men can be in solidarity with women, and as much as I believe that women suffer more in rape culture, Black women in particular, I believe that we are also the ones who have the greatest power to transform it, to subvert it, overturn it, right? And to me, this is why it's so important for women to preach despite systemic barriers, to preach despite people telling you no, to preach despite not having models, is because when you stand in the pulpit, right? And I've said this in a number of contexts, before you say a word, a woman's body proclaims a God of inclusion and empowerment, proclaims a God who's bigger than laws and systems, who's bigger than culture, a God who's calling women out of perpetual weakness and victimization and into powerful places like pulpits. So our bodies have a way of preaching before we ever even open up our mouths. And this is why it's important that women continue to say yes, and why I will always be a champion of women who preach. And embody resistance from below. This is just basically my idea that subversion is key, because as women, we are most impacted by the culture, which is why we are, our resistance is going to be the one to overturn it. If you can imagine items sitting on top of a rug, pull the rug out hard enough, everything on top of it topples. And that's an act of subversion, overturning from below, right? The thing that everything else is on top of, the thing that everything else is mounted on. When it pulls itself out from under that, everything has to fall. And so I really believe that this is why it's critical. This is probably, to me, the most powerful disruption of rape culture in the church and in the pulpit, from the pulpit, is when women stand up and proclaim God's word. Now, I will qualify that if you are a woman who hates other women, I'm not talking about you. If you are a woman who is a misogynist, then I'm not talking about you. You're part of the problem. But if you are a woman who's ready and willing to stand up and say something positive about women, to put our stories in the forefront and to denounce the evil that is rape culture, then we're on the same side. Thank you so much. Hope this was helpful.
Here we go. Thank you so much, Neichelle. That was such a rich presentation. I was furiously taking notes, and there's been so much discussion going on in the chat box since you've been talking. Lots of questions. We'll try to get to as many as we can. We are a little bit over time, but that's okay. So folks, if you're out there, you want to hang with us, we'll hang for a few more minutes here and try to get to a few of the questions. We won't be able to get to all of them. Some of them have been answered in the context of what Neichelle has been talking about tonight. You all have been asking questions since the very beginning, but we'll try to get to as many as we can. But thank you so much. That was such a rich presentation. You took us to school and preached and everything, all in that time. The last point that you made about women and women's some women's participation in patriarchy and rape culture and misogyny, that brings up to mind a couple of questions that came up both earlier and just in the last couple of minutes since you stopped. Can you talk a little bit more? We have one question that the person is asking, can you define what makes a woman a misogynist? And relatedly to that question, someone asked earlier, how do you help women who refuse to see rape culture as a concern and who appear to live in ease within patriarchy? Because I know you gave the brothers a lot of good guidance about things that they should be doing to subvert this as well. And I think that the onus in many ways needs to be on men to be dismantling the structural, the systemic dysfunction that contributes to keeping this culture going. But I think that you brought up a key point there that I think doesn't always get talked about, and that is ways that women are socialized into, are forced into, kind of the ease or the comfortability of participating in misogynistic behavior.
Yeah. I wish that I had like a more direct answer
Sure.
For this question, but in my work and in my ministry, what I have found, my ethic might just be like reclaiming my time, right? Thank you, Congresswoman Maxine Waters, for that language, because I have tried to talk to women who've exuded patriarchal attitudes and behaviors. But in some sense, I've had to take on the attitude of that's not my battle anymore, right? The same way I don't think that it's my battle to talk to white people about
Sure.
racism. But I think that part of the problem here is that for many women who are trying to navigate these spaces, it hurts more when other women are part of the problem. It hurts more when you should have a sister in the woman who is in a more powerful position in the church you work at, but you can't get her to respect you. Women are often, we see in churches, women are often put in certain positions by male senior leaders to carry out their dirty work, right? And in that sense, right, it's that proximity to power. Here we go with power again, right? That makes it very, very hard to argue with another woman about how she is reifying patriarchy even to another woman. And I think, we see this in a lot of our church settings where, you have that church mother, you have those women in the church who are going to be loyal to their pastor, right? No matter what. Yeah. And also still those women who don't think that other women should be preaching. I can't recount the times, that I was invited to preach, and I was told by women you shouldn't wear those heels, they're too high, or you should have something else on to cover your body, and so all of that to say that the policing of our bodies and the creation of barriers is not always that's not always a men's work, right? We see women doing the same things. Some of them know that they're doing it. Some of them don't.
Mm-hmm.
But particularly to the ones who you know better, right? In some sense, the attitude that I've taken on is, reclaiming my time sideswipe, because that's not my mission to tell you that, you should love yourself.
Sure.
Because in hating on other women, you probably more exposed how you feel about yourself.
Mm-hmm.
I could probably continue to ramble, but that is a particular challenge because of the pain that it causes. But I see that, as another iteration of how patriarchy has got us all fiending for some power, fiending for some even if we're just close to it, it makes us feel like we have more of it than we often really have, right? And so women with power, in powerful positions, often have another kind of question to ask themselves is, how am I using what I do have
Mm-hmm.
in support of women?
Sure. Yeah.
Whether it's a platform or a title, or I have some extra money in my budget to hire a consultant, how am I circulating these dollars between me and my Black sisters?
Mm-hmm.
To me, when we decide that we're going to be sisterly to each other, when we're going to support each other, which is the whole idea behind She Preaches. This is anti-patriarchy. This is anti-rape culture when we decide I'm going to be on the side of my sisters.
Mm-hmm.
And whatever I have is going to be of service to them, or is going to be in service to creating a world and a church that's safer for them.
Mm-hmm. And I think that ties into Reverend Dr. Claudette Copeland's piece that you had us to listen to today.
Yes.
Hopefully, most of you all out there in the audience got an opportunity to listen to it. And if not, please take some time to watch that interview, because you can't teach people about preaching without teaching about, and she talks about this in the interview, and you've talked about this tonight a lot, the interior life of the preacher, right?
Yes.
What is going on in the life of the preacher? What is going on in your heart? What is the thing that she used the word that she could touch?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that part of dismantling patriarchy, part of speaking back against rape culture, mm-hmm. for both men who are complicit or who benefit from the system of rape culture, as well as women who are victimized mostly by it, is to think about, and you empower women at the end of your remarks to really stand in our boldness, to stand in our witness, our body as witness. But we're doing that, kind of juxtaposed against what we were talking about earlier, which was the perpetual vulnerability, how we constantly are having to be on guard for our safety. So our bodies are both these beautiful sacred spaces of resistance, mm-hmm. while and that, right, makes us vulnerable as well, mm-hmm. in so many ways. And so I just really encourage folks to take a listen to her to Reverend Claudette Copeland's interview with Frank Thomas, because it really is, she is talking all about the interior life as well as the embodiment of what it means to be a woman in ministry, and what it means for men to be supportive of us as well.
Cantina, I also want to say that one of the other things she does in that conversation is she talks about, as a little girl, how she needed to be protected from certain men in her church.
Yes.
How the older women in the church protected her or told her who to avoid. And even in her more seasoned years, she talks about her husband, protecting her from men in the church. So I thought that was very powerful, kind of illustration of, how the culture is so pervasive that women often do need that protection. A lot of us who come from church will talk about covering, but then it raises a question to people like me, unmarried women, yes. Who covers me? Who covers me? And I think I always circle back to my girlfriends. I always circle back to the women who stood up in sisterhood in my life, mm-hmm. Which is why that to me is, again, so critical to dismantling patriarchy. sisterhood in particular. Yeah.
One question that came in, and you can talk maybe a little bit to this with your experience so far at Spelman, and I know that you're working closely with the Title IX folks and just, having supporting students who are have experienced sexual violence. Someone asked, how can we disciple people who come forward? So folks who are coming forward to say, perhaps this sermon unearthed something in me that I had been pushing down, or, this is the first time that I heard somebody name what happened to me, where I've been in this church my whole life and I've heard nothing but how terrible of a person I was or how it was my fault.
Yeah.
So maybe you can talk a little bit about, as you're pastoring students there or in your other ministry placements where you have seen what happens at the intersection of preaching against rape culture and folks being activated spiritually to say, me too.
For sure. I have a little bit of experience here at Spelman to draw on, as I've only been here since March, but I have some more experience to draw on from Trinity.
Yeah.
But I would say pastorally, there's not enough to be said about the ministry of presence, and being the witness of another person that is affirming, that is present to hear, that's present as long as you need me to be present. And I take great pride in my clergy identity, because as clergy, we are in a very unique position that clinicians aren't always in a position to do, that medical professionals aren't always to do. And that's to be able to say, like, this was not God's idea. Mm-hmm. And this was not God's doing. And God is with you right now. And as an agent of God, like, I am here to comfort you. I'm here to be present and to pray, right? Mm-hmm. In my tradition, I mean, we believe in the laying on of hands and the working of energy and the Reiki and things like that. And to be able to do that from a theological, a spiritual place is a very unique privilege, which is why on the flip side, it's so detrimental when clergy abuse that power, right? Mm-hmm. But to be able to provide that pastoral presence of, and to be a vessel for the Holy Spirit, to be a conduit for God's Spirit to reach out and embrace, is very special. I am one of these people, clergy, who recognize, though, that might be the end of my road, Sure. Working in concert with other professionals mm-hmm. is critical, because as I said before, I recognize my limitations, we have to all recognize where we're limited. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, I do work with Title IX. And prior to when I was at Trinity, I referred people out, this is not my area, but I want to recommend that you go speak to XYZ. I want to recommend that you go be evaluated. I want to recommend and then make referrals. And I think sometimes we underestimate that referrals are some of the most professional and pastoral things that we can do when we're entering into a territory that's not our expertise. Mm-hmm. I saw that done really well at Trinity. Pastor Moss, Otis Moss III, who's the senior pastor at Trinity, where I was on staff for just a little under 7 years, preached a phenomenal sermon on, I believe, on Tamar. Mm-hmm. Yes, it was Tamar. And brought in the arts and brought in embodiment in such a powerful way, and had actually contacted several ministries to be on hand in the sanctuary for when service was over. Mm-hmm. So the counseling ministry, the prayer ministry, the healing ministry, the counseling ministry being constituted by professionals. Mm-hmm. So that right there in the sanctuary, right? Not even in the vestibule, like in the sanctioning space of the sanctuary, people would be able to just linger and get what they needed, right? And so I thought that was done really well. And I do think that we have to be prepared with relationships and referrals. to be able to say when we are not the professional for this particular need.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And one final question that I think is related to that, and I'm sorry for everyone that's watching that we can't get to all of the questions because we have such short amount of time, but connected to that, at the end of your presentation, you talked about justice and what justice looked like, both sort of the restoring of the brokenness that happens within our communities because of violence, because of patriarchy, because of rape culture, and justice that also looks like getting, tangible justice involved in situations and circumstances where someone has done something that has violated a law, has abused someone, has sexually violated someone, etc. And so we got a pretty interesting question from someone that asked this question related to justice. How do we hold in tension dismantling rape culture and dismantling the prison industrial complex, especially when most of the punitive responses to violence against women result in men being in the prison industrial complex? How can we be both for the abolition of prisons, and I'm not assuming that you are for prison abolition, but this is what the question says, and also at the same time for accountability for those who commit violence? And what might that look like? So it may not necessarily be prison abolition, but and maybe there's no right answer to that, but it certainly is a conversation that I think is happening as this comes up.
I think you're right. And I think it's an incredible, I think it is a tension, but I do think that when we talk about the prison industrial complex, we are talking about the over punishment and the privatization, over punishments for petty crimes or convictions and punishments that are not always in proportion to the crime, right? And we're also talking about the capitalist privatization of prisons, right? When we're talking about the complex. I do think that there's a function that has been grossly tampered with, I guess is a word, that there's inside of the system that says that there are consequences, right, for certain actions. And I do think that, the criminal justice system is a farce, right? We all know that, especially if you are a person who looks like me. But I do think that there's a usefulness in the idea that those who commit crimes should face a consequence for it. And I don't mean like an extravagant consequence. I'm currently reading Just Mercy by Bryan Stevenson. What I'm gathering from the book is, first of all, Bryan Stevenson is amazing, but his whole fight is against the fact that Black people in particular face unequal consequences. And so there's that. And I think that that's true. And that is, numbers and figures prove it, stories prove it. But I do think that when it comes to the systemic devaluation of women, especially Black women, that there has to be some kind of a consequence when acts of violence are committed against those bodies, especially if there's a consequence for violence that's perpetrated against white bodies. And so you all have to forgive me for not having kind of felt my way through that. And in some sense, I probably need to do more theological and theoretical work around that. But I just think that for right now, there needs, and I'm interested also in this idea of restorative justice and how punitive justice is in contrast to it. But what does that look like? But because I don't really know. I don't really know because, when sexualized violence, especially when it is, when it results in death, right? I've got to feel my way through that one. And
Yeah.
I think that I'm smart enough to be able to say, I don't know.
Yes. And I think that that's a great place to stop, because I think that I think that more preachers, more practitioners need to be able to say, I'm still working through that. I'm still wrestling through that. I'm still discerning my way and reading and studying and praying and all of the different ways that we get to how we come to understand these complex life situations and circumstances.
For sure.
And I think that you have given us some absolutely wonderful tools tonight to be thinking through our interior selves as preachers and as practitioners, and how to participate in something different, how to participate in a new way of being in the pulpit, a new way of being related to women in the Bible and women in the world, women in the church. And so I am so grateful. And I know that all of the folks that have been watching have just been so engaged in this conversation, and they're asking us, can we do it again and find some time to do a part 2 to just get to some of these questions, because people are really excited about what you have to say and about where this may go with your project. We did have a couple questions. Folks were asking, is there a way to read your dissertation? Is there somewhere that they can read that on ProQuest or somewhere? Is it out there that they can read it?
The dissertation is in the process of being edited for a book.
Okay.
So I'm always kind of making these connections in my preaching, you know, and I'm not that I'm always preaching about rape, but in terms of my hermeneutics and my metrics that I shared, and I tried to illustrate that with the sermon that I submitted and I think this. So yes and no.
Stay tuned.
Stay tuned.
So those of you who are watching, stay tuned, and we will figure out a way at some point for you all to get an opportunity to see Dr. Guidry's all of her hard blood, sweat, and tears during her PhD program come into a beautiful project and product for all of us to partake in.
Definitely. And as we're talking about the dissertation, I want to shout out my advisor, Dr. Jennifer Brooks, who was a huge supporter of this project. And just like one more minute, if you all could stand, I want to recommend a couple of books.
Great.
Not my dissertation, however. This is the book from my pastor, Pastor Copeland, Stories from Inner Space, where she just gives us more of her story, including her assault narratives.
Yes.
And how she kind of navigated that. The Cry of Tamar, Violence Against Women and the Church's Response, Pamela Cooper White. This was basically my second Bible during the writing phase. Rape, Culture, and Spiritual Violence, Religion, Testimony, and Visions of Healing by Gina Messina Desert is excellent as well. Not Without a Struggle, Leadership Development for African American Women in Ministry. Vashti McKenzie writes about these kinds of patriarchal barriers to a lot of women's ministry journey. So there's that, and I think that's very useful. Just a Sister Away.
Oh, yes.
A Womanist Vision of Women's Relationships in the Bible by Renita Weems. And Sisters in the Wilderness, The Challenge of Womanist God Talk by Dolores Williams. These two books are some of the most incredible anything, anywhere, but these two are really helpful in terms of embodying and teaching a form of womanist exegesis that really gets to the heart of race, class, misogyny, and exemplifies what I mean by humanizing women, right?
Absolutely.
Never even heard of Hagar as a Black woman before I read Sisters in the Wilderness. It's groundbreaking. Towards a Womanist Ethic of Incarnation by my sis Ebony Marshall Turman is an incredible book, because what she's probing is why we hate bodies the way that we do, why we hate Black women's bodies the ways that we do, and helping us to reconstruct our vision of our bodies by talking about the incarnation of Christ. So good. And then the classic Sexuality in the Black Church by Kelly Brown Douglas. where she calls out a lot of these same structures and ideologies as well.
And for the participants who are watching, we'll make sure to get a book list out to all of you, a bibliography. So don't worry if you missed some of the titles. We'll get something out to you via email so that you can pick those books up. And we don't want to forget that Reverend Neichelle has a book as well.
Oh my gosh, I
do! Someone posted it in the comments. So she's going to bring a copy of that so she can show all of you, so you can support her there as well.
Curating a World, Sermonic Words from a Young Woman Who Preaches. That's my book.
Well, thank you so much for being with us tonight and hanging with us. You had lots of great, just wonderful content. And I know we could talk for hours. And so we'll think about, I know it's fine. It's totally fine. So we'll think about how we might expand this and talk some more when we have some time and can fit into your schedule down at Spelman, because I know that the students there are keeping you very busy, but very blessed as well. And so we thank all of you who have been with us tonight, asking great questions.
Yeah.
You all have Reverend Neichelle's information, her Twitter handle, her Instagram handle, her website, where you can email her there if you have any more questions that are just burning and you couldn't get them answered tonight because we ran out of time. Please watch those 3 links. Check your email. So the second reminder email that you got after the first one has all of the links in there. And so if you want to take a look at the sermons that and interviews that she referenced tonight, those will be there as well. And you will receive a recording of tonight so you can watch it later, as well as a bibliography with the books, the suggested book list in that email. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Continue to tweet if you have more remarks and reflections for tonight. And we'll see you at our next webinar. Thanks, Neichelle.
Yes, thank you all so much. God bless you.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Cantina.
You're welcome.
Bye.
Bye-bye.